The shift supervisor's voice came through the radio at 17 minutes past 2 in the morning, sharp enough to cut through the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. "Harker, I told you once already. Remove him from the premises." Joel Harker didn't answer right away. He was standing in the east waiting area of Briar Ridge General Hospital, about 4 feet from the man in the corner chair, and what he was looking at made him hesitant in a way that had nothing to do with policy, and everything to do with what 11 years of overnight security work had taught him about the color of a person's face at 2 in the morning. "If he goes outside and something happens," Joel said into the radio, "I won't be able to live with that." He set the radio on the counter beside him, crouched down to the man's eye level, and asked him quietly whether he was in any pain. It would be 9 weeks before anyone in that hospital understood what those 2 minutes had cost him. Joel Harker was 51 years old, and he had been working the overnight shift at Briar Ridge General for going on 7 years. He lived in a rental unit on the east side of the city with a coffee maker he'd had since his marriage, a daughter named Lily who stayed with him every second weekend, and a 2009 Civic that he had once calculated would cost more to fix than it was worth and had fixed anyway, because he needed a car and the car was already paid for. His marriage had ended 4 years before, not in a single loud event, but in the gradual way a window fogs over in winter, slowly from the edges inward, until one day you couldn't see through it at all. He paid child support reliably and visited Lily as often as the schedule allowed, and he carried in his chest at all times a small, precise fear that one missed payment or one piece of bad luck would tip the scale with the family court in a direction he didn't want to think about. He had taken the overnight position at Briar Ridge because it paid slightly better than day shifts, and because the nature of the work, long, quiet stretches broken by specific problems, suited the way his mind operated. He was not a social man by most people's definition, but he was attentive in the way that people who have been through hard things often become, alert to what was going wrong in a room before it had fully gone wrong. He knew the names of the overnight nurses on every ward. He knew which entrance the supply trucks used, which stairwell the radiologists used as a shortcut, which vending machine on the second floor took loonies without jamming. He had been told twice by the director of patient services that the families in the cardiac waiting area specifically asked for him when they arrived at night, because he was the one who found them blankets without being asked. His shift supervisor had never mentioned that. Brenda Hoyle measured security performance in incident logs, patrol completeness scores, and speed of response to removal requests. She had been in the role for 3 years, and she ran it with the particular efficiency of someone who had learned that the safest way to keep a job was to never allow anything to become her problem. Anything that didn't fit the protocol was, by her definition, a problem in the making. People lingering in waiting areas without visible cause were a problem. Individuals who appeared disheveled or confused were a problem. Security staff who asked follow-up questions instead of following the removal procedure were also, increasingly, a problem. She had made that clear to Joel twice already, in formal language, in a room with the assistant operations director present. He had not argued either time. He had nodded and said he understood the policy and signed the acknowledgement form and gone back to work. And he had continued doing his job in the same manner he always had, because the policy was one thing, and the man in the east waiting area at 2 in the morning was something else entirely. Albert Renshaw had walked through the hospital's main entrance at 1:54 a.m. that Thursday in October. He was 68 years old, and nothing about his appearance announced that. He wore a canvas jacket that had been washed more times than it had color left in it, and brown trousers with a hem that had come partially undone on the left leg. He carried no bag. He had a watch on his wrist that looked older than he did, and he sat down in the east waiting area with the careful, deliberate movement of a man whose joints had opinions about chairs. Rick Solano, who was working the main desk that night, had clocked him on the monitor and radioed Brenda Hoyle as procedure required for any unaccompanied individual presenting without apparent medical registration after midnight. That was also procedure. Joel wasn't in the waiting area when Albert arrived. He was finishing a check of the third-floor stairwells and came down to find Rick leaning against the desk with his arms crossed and Brenda on the radio, already running through the removal checklist, in the tone she used when she had already made the decision and the checklist was a formality. Joel looked at the man in the corner chair and asked Rick how long he'd been sitting there. 10 minutes maybe. Hasn't asked for anything, hasn't said anything. Joel walked over. Albert's name came out slowly when asked, as though he'd had to locate it from somewhere far back. He said he wasn't sure what had brought him down to the hospital at this hour, that he'd woken up feeling not quite right, that he'd driven over, that he was probably being foolish. Joel asked whether the not quite right feeling was in his chest. Albert looked at him with something that might have been surprise and said, yes, along the left side, that he'd had a procedure done there 8 months ago, that he was sure it was nothing. The radio crackled. Brenda's voice came through very clearly. She said she had an incident log to close and asked Joel to confirm that the removal was in progress. Joel looked at Albert's face, which had the particular gray-white tone of someone whose body was working harder than it was letting on, and felt something settle in him with a kind of quiet finality. I'm going to get a nurse, he said to Albert. He called to Wendy Park, the triage nurse he knew from 100 overnight shifts, and he told her in a single sentence what he was seeing. She came out from behind the station without being asked twice, took one look at Albert, and was already speaking into her earpiece by the time she reached him. What happened in the following 4 minutes happened quickly. A wheelchair appeared. Someone from cardiology responded to a page. Albert Renshaw was taken through the double doors that led into the assessment wing, and the east waiting area was empty again before the overhead lights had cycled through one full flicker. Joel stood with his radio in his hand. Brenda was already walking in from the south corridor. She'd seen the last of it from 20 meters away, and her face had the look of someone who had been handed an excuse to do something they had been planning to do for a while. She told Joel that he had interfered with the standard removal procedure, that he had escalated a low-priority loitering situation into a medical response without authorization, and that he had ignored a direct order from a supervising officer. She said it was his third documented deviation from protocol in 14 months. She said it at a normal conversational volume, but she said it with Rick standing nearby and with 2 nurses at the desk, which Joel understood to be deliberate. He told her the man had had cardiac surgery 8 months ago and was describing left side chest discomfort. She told him she was aware of his own medical opinion. He told her that if he had followed procedure, the man would have been sitting outside alone in a parking lot at 2 in the morning with no phone, no family nearby, and a possible cardiac event. She told him that was speculation, and that his position was not a medical one, and that this was the 3rd time she was having this conversation. She said she would be filing an incident report, and that she was recommending termination. She asked Rick to begin the end-of-shift paperwork on Harker's file. Joel handed over his key card. He walked to the locker room, changed out of his uniform, and put his personal jacket on over the t-shirt he'd worn underneath. He sat on the bench for a moment and looked at the floor. Then he picked up his bag and walked out through the side exit into the parking lot at 2:37 in the morning. And he sat in the old Civic with the heater running until the shaking in his hands had stopped enough to drive. The weeks that followed had a rhythm that was hard to explain to people who hadn't lived it. It wasn't chaos. It was the quiet, grinding kind of difficulty that leaves a person more tired at the end of a day of doing nothing than a day of hard work. Joel had 17 years of experience across 3 healthcare facilities, a clean record of employment at Briar Ridge up until that morning, and a reference list that should have moved a file to the top of any security hiring stack in the province. He filed applications every day for the first 2 weeks and felt reasonable about it. He interviewed for a position at a private hospital on the north side of the city and was told by the hiring coordinator that it had gone very well. He interviewed at a long-term care facility and at a transit authority depot and at a court services building that was hiring for day security, which would have meant giving up the overnight differential, but which he would have taken without hesitation. None of them called back. The transit authority was the one that told him why. The supervisor there, a woman who seemed genuinely uncomfortable with what she was saying, told him that she'd run the standard employment check, which included a call to his most recent position, and that the account she had received described a pattern of insubordination, a failure to follow direct orders during a critical incident, and an escalation that had required administrative correction. She said she was sorry. She said she hoped he found something. He sat in his car in the Transit Authority parking lot and thought about the exact phrasing, administrative correction, and understood that Brenda Hoyle had managed to package what had happened in a way that was technically accurate and practically devastating, and that there was no court he could bring it to, because nothing she had said was a lie. The problem with the truth, when only one side of it is spoken at a time, is that it doesn't sound like half a truth. It sounds like the truth. He made the rent for October from savings. He covered his support payment for Lily by selling a road bike he'd bought, with the intention of cycling to work a plan that had never quite happened. In November, he had a conversation with his ex-wife that he had not wanted to have, and she had been kinder about it than he'd expected, which somehow made it harder. He picked up 2 nights of volunteer security work at a community center just to have somewhere to be, and because the alternative was sitting at his kitchen table, running the same calculations until past midnight. In the 6th week, a man he'd worked with briefly at his previous facility before Briar Ridge reached out through a mutual contact and told him that word had gotten around. He said it carefully, in the way people say things they don't want to be the one to say. He said that Brida Hoyle had a reputation in the network for closing gaps in exit paperwork in ways that didn't leave former employees much room to maneuver. That Joel wasn't the first, that 2 people before him had had similar experiences after removal disputes, and that both of them had quietly relocated to other cities rather than spend another year fighting something that cost more to fight than to survive. Joel thanked him and hung up and poured himself a glass of water and stood at the kitchen window looking at the street light until it occurred to him that he had been standing there for almost 20 minutes and had not once considered turning on the light in the room. He had not thought much about the man in the east waiting area during those weeks. It wasn't avoidance exactly. It was more that there was no useful thread to pull there. He didn't know the man's surname. The hospital wouldn't give him patient information. He didn't know whether Albert had been admitted or treated and sent home. He hoped the man was fine and tried not to think about what it would mean if he wasn't, and he set that thought aside because some things you can only carry in the direction away from you. He thought instead about Lily, about what the next family court review would say if he showed up unemployed, about whether the extra weekend he'd been granted informally would get taken back, about the way she'd asked him 3 weeks earlier why he looked tired, and he'd said he was fine in the same tone he always used when he wanted her not to worry. Nathan Renshaw had not been at the hospital on the night his father was brought through the assessment doors at 2:41 a.m. He had been called at 3 lakh and had driven from his home in 40 minutes, and had arrived to find his father awake, grumbling about the IV line in his arm, and telling a nurse in a cheerfully stubborn way that he'd known the moment he got there that it was going to turn out to be nothing. It had not been nothing. It had been a small and detectable arrhythmia related to the work done 8 months earlier, and the cardiologist on call was clear that catching it when they had caught it, rather than 4 hours later, was the relevant variable in how well things had gone. Nathan had sat beside his father's bed until 6 in the morning, and then gone home and canceled his Thursday meetings. He was the kind of man who canceled things methodically rather than emotionally, going down the list in order, and so it wasn't until the afternoon that he asked his father, carefully, the way you ask someone who has recently had a fright how they came to be in a place, how it had all happened. Albert told him the whole thing, including the part about the security guard. He said the man had come over and asked the right question. He said he thought there had been a supervisor or someone on a radio, but he'd been too foggy by then to follow the details. He said the guard had crouched down so he didn't have to look up, which for some reason had been the thing that stuck with him. Nathan Renshaw was the executive chair of the Renshaw Family Foundation, which had funded, among other things, 2 of Briar Ridge General's capital expansions, the diagnostic imaging wing, and a significant portion of the overnight staffing model. He was not a man who traded on that. He had learned that from his father, who had spent 30 years quietly funding things and loudly refusing to be photographed at the openings. But he was also not a man who let important information sit without doing anything with it. He called the hospital's patient relations office Friday morning and asked for the security incident log from the early hours of that Thursday. He was told that patient relations didn't typically have access to security operations records. He said he understood and asked who did. He made 3 more calls before the end of Friday and had the document by Monday. The log entry filed by Brenda Hoyle recorded the incident under unauthorized escalation of standard removal procedure. It noted the responding officer by surname, Harker. It noted that the officer had been issued a verbal correction and that a formal recommendation for termination had been filed. It did not note that the individual the officer had refused to remove had been admitted to cardiology within 15 minutes of the incident. Nathan asked his assistant to find the security camera recordings from the east waiting area between 1:50 and 2:45 a.m. that Thursday. He watched them that afternoon on his laptop with the audio on. He watched his father sit down in the corner chair and fold his hands in his lap. He watched the guard come in and stop, and he could see from the footage exactly what the guard had seen: the wrong color in the face, the hand drifting to the left side, the shoulders held at an angle that spoke of managed discomfort. He watched the supervisor's number come up on the radio and watched Joel Harker set the radio down. He watched his father get wheeled through the double doors and watched the supervisor walk in from the south corridor and watched Joel hand over his key card and walk out. He went back through 3 more months of footage after that, not because he needed to, but because something in the log entry, third documented deviation, had caught his attention. He wanted to understand what the first 2 deviations looked like. The first involved an elderly woman who had become disoriented in the parking structure and whom Joel had escorted inside to a waiting area seat and stayed with until a family member arrived, instead of calling a cab as the protocol specified. The second involved a young man in visible distress at the main entrance whom Joel had identified as potentially in crisis and redirected to the psychiatric intake, rather than removing him from the property as the initial assessment had categorized the situation. All 3 incidents had been filed by Brenda Hoyle. All 3 had been resolved without negative outcome. All 3 were recorded as protocol failures. Nathan read the hospital's conduct policy for the 3rd time after that, and then called his father's cardiologist and asked one specific question. If Albert Renshaw had been escorted out of the building at 2 in the morning and driven himself home, what would the probable timeline have been? The cardiologist paused before answering. When she did, she chose her words carefully. She said that by the time the arrhythmia would have been symptomatic enough for Albert to have called anyone on his own, the window for effective intervention would have been considerably narrower. Nathan thanked her and hung up. He asked his assistant to find an address for a former Briar Ridge security employee named Harker. The letter arrived on a Wednesday by courier, which was the only reason it got through. Joel's phone had been on a reduced plan for 3 weeks, and he wasn't checking it reliably. It was from a law office he had never heard of, and it said, in clean and careful language, that he had been identified in connection with a patient care incident on the 14th of October, that his employment record was being reviewed, and that his presence was requested at Briar Ridge General at 9 o'clock Friday morning. He read it twice at his kitchen table, and assumed it meant that Brenda Hoyle had found one more lever, that someone upstairs wanted a release form signed, that the point was to make his account go away on paper with his own name on the document. He went because the alternative was not going, and not going had never solved anything in his experience. The hospital had clearly been prepared for something. Joel could see it as he crossed the parking lot. There were vehicles he didn't recognize near the administrative entrance, a cluster of people in suits near the main doors, and every security officer who was normally on morning shift was at their post with a precision that didn't match the normal rhythm of the day. Brenda Hoyle was at the main entrance. She saw Joel come across the lot, and her face did something he hadn't seen it do in 7 years. It went uncertain. She said this was an internal operations review, and that he was not authorized to be on hospital property. He held up the letter. She didn't reach for it. She told him to wait near the entrance and not to speak to anyone. He waited. 3 cars came in behind a 4th and parked in the reserved spaces near the entrance. Men and women in professional dress got out carrying folders. One of them held the door for an older man in a canvas jacket with a partially unraveled hem, the same watch on his wrist that Joel remembered from 6 weeks earlier in the corner chair. Albert Renshaw walked with a slight slowness that hadn't been there at 2 in the morning, when his body had been focused on something more urgent than posture. He stood next to a man in his 50s who had the same measured stillness about him, and who looked at the building the way people look at things they've built and aren't entirely sure they should be proud of. Brenda stepped forward with her hands clasped and began something about being happy to meet the new oversight representatives, some phrase she'd prepared. The man beside Albert said, "Nathan Renshaw," and said it in the polite way that doesn't leave room for the conversation to go anywhere else. Albert turned toward the entrance and then stopped. He scanned the people standing outside with the slow attention of someone who is looking for a specific thing. His gaze went past Brenda. It went past the nursing supervisor who had come down to observe. It landed on Joel, who was standing off to the side with his hands in his jacket, pockets the way a person stands when they don't know what their hands are supposed to be doing. Albert pointed. He said to his son and to the people near his son and to anyone close enough to hear, "That's the man I told you about." Joel had not expected it. He had spent 6 weeks building a clean mental wall around the whole thing. The waiting area, the night, the radio, all of it, because there was no use in expecting, and the wall had been necessary for surviving the weeks intact. Now the wall came down in about 2 seconds, and what replaced it wasn't emotion exactly. It was the recognition of being seen by someone who had made the effort to find him. Nathan spoke to the hospital staff the way someone speaks when they have done their research and don't intend to be interrupted. He said that his family's connection to Briar Ridge General spanned 2 decades, and that he was not there to damage the hospital's reputation. Because what had happened on the 14th of October was not, in his assessment, a hospital failure. It was a supervisory failure within a measurement system that had been allowed to define performance incorrectly for too long. He said, the incident logs reviewed by his team showed a 3-year pattern of staff being formally disciplined for actions that led to positive patient outcomes, and informally rewarded for metrics that did not reflect patient care at all. He said that Brenda Hoyle had done her job exactly as it was designed to be done, and that the design of the job was what required immediate correction. Brenda's expression had been moving through stages since Albert stepped out of the car. Joel watched it without satisfaction, because he had learned a long time ago that watching someone else have a bad moment didn't make your own better. What he felt instead was a simple and enormous tiredness, the kind that comes after a thing has finally ended. Brenda's role was suspended pending review. 2 members of the security team who had filed supporting documentation for the termination letter were reassigned pending the same. One of the lawyers from Nathan's team brought Joel inside to a meeting room and placed a folder on the table between them. The wrongful dismissal settlement covered 6 weeks of lost income, the forfeited accrual from his sick bank, and something the lawyer called demonstrable reference interference. 3 of the employers Joel had applied to had agreed, when contacted, to document in writing the nature of the reference they had received from Briar Ridge. Joel read through the figure and then looked up and said, "This covers the child support." The lawyer said it covered considerably more than that. Nathan came in after the paperwork was finished and sat across from Joel and said the part he had come to say in person. He told him that the hospital's overnight security protocol was being overhauled with input from patient advocacy teams, and that the new standard would be written by someone who understood what it was like to stand at a desk at 2 in the morning and make a decision with no backup and a radio in your hand. He said he wasn't offering Joel the position as compensation. He said the compensation was the check already signed. He said he was offering the position because a man who, on a cold October night, had set down a radio, crouched to eye level with a stranger, and asked the right question. That was someone worth asking to help build the standard that replaced the one that had tried to remove him. Joel said he had a condition. He said it plainly, because in his experience, there was no useful softening of something you meant. He said the protocol overhaul had to cover the full spectrum, not just what security staff were allowed to do, but what they were expected to notice. Not just how to respond to a medical signal, but how to see one before it had become impossible to miss. He said the performance measurement couldn't continue to reward a cleared waiting room while ignoring what the clearing had cost. Nathan said yes without looking at the folder. He said the measurement system was precisely what his team had identified in the audit, and that reversing it was the first item on the operations list. Joel shook his hand. He started in the second week of December. The work was different from anything he'd done before. More meeting rooms than corridors, more drafting sessions than patrols, and he approached it with the same attention he had always brought to the overnight floor, which was the attention of someone who understood that the details other people skimmed past were usually the ones that mattered. The new protocol took 4 months to finalize. He insisted that it be rolled out in person at every shift across every site, and he was present for the first sessions himself. He did not tell the story of Albert Renshaw during the training. He was asked to, and he declined each time, because the man in that story had spent 68 years going unrecognized in order to move through the world as a private person, and Joel was not going to put him into a training video in exchange for making a point that could be made without him. He told the story without the names instead. He described a man in a corner chair at 2 in the morning, a hand drifting to the left side of a chest, a radio call. The moment where the question was, do you follow the procedure or do you follow what you can see? He told it the same way each time, and each time someone in the room asked what the right answer was. Joel always gave the same response. He says the right answer was the reason they were all in that room. The right answer was that a procedure which punishes that choice is a procedure that needs to be rewritten, and they were rewriting it. Briar Ridge's overnight patient satisfaction scores changed inside a single quarter. The shift supervisors who came up through the new evaluation model stopped measuring cleared incidents and started measuring resolved ones, which were not the same thing and had never been the same thing. The difference showed in the numbers, but Joel noticed it more in the building itself, in the way the waiting areas felt at 3 a.m., in the way the desk staff held their posture when someone came through the main doors looking not quite right. Albert kept coming in for his cardiology follow-ups. He drove himself. He wore the same canvas jacket. He stopped at the main desk on his way through and said good morning to whoever was working, and they said good morning back, and he went upstairs. He and Joel spoke occasionally in the corridors, the way people do when they share a building and have a reason to nod at each other. It was never a long conversation. Albert was not a man who needed things to be longer than they were. One afternoon in March, 6 months after the October night, Albert stopped in the hallway outside Joel's office and said, without preamble, that his son had told him what Joel had been building. He said it seemed like important work. Joel thanked him and said he thought so too. Albert nodded once and kept walking. Joel sat back down at his desk and looked at the draft protocol open on his screen. Page 14, the section on overnight risk recognition, which he had been revising for the 3rd time because he hadn't yet found language precise enough to capture what he meant. He thought about how some things can't be reduced to a checklist, how you can write down all the indicators, every clinical signal and visible cue, but what you're really trying to teach is a habit of attention. The willingness to pause in a corridor and look at a person as a person before you look at them as an entry in a log. He thought about the moment he had crouched down beside a stranger in a corner chair and asked one question. Not because a protocol told him to, not because he knew who the man was, because the man was there and the man needed to be asked. That was the whole of it, and it had always been the whole of it, from the moment the radio clicked in his hand, to the morning he walked into this building with a different key card and a different mandate. He went back to page 14 and found finally the right words.